Oh, welcome everybody. Uh, Delighted that you could all join us here online. My name is Ilan Berman. I'm the Senior Vice President of the American Foreign Policy Council. And I am delighted to bring you here and have you join us online this afternoon for the third in our series of virtual events on the changing nature of Islamic extremism and the Western struggle against it. We had previous installments in November and in late September, covering the Islamic State, covering the nature of Islamism and Islamic extremism in North and West Africa. You can find those recordings online on AFPC's YouTube channel or on the American Foreign Policy Council website, www.afpc.org. Today's event, the third in our series, is going to tackle the topics of the Muslim Brotherhood in Turkey. And just like our past sessions, this event is tied to and it draws heavily from our one of our signature projects at the American Foreign Policy Council called the World Almanac of Islamism. And for those of you that aren't familiar with it, the Almanac is a scholarly web and print resource that's designed to track trends in political Islam over time on a local, regional, and international level. It's an effort that we've administered for nearly a decade, and we're now just in the next couple of days closing out our 2021 edition. Many of the chapters from that collection are already available online. In fact, all of them have been updated for the 2021 edition, and they're available online at almanac.afpc.org. And I encourage all of you to visit the Almanac online and to explore it for yourselves. When you do, what you'll see is that the Almanac is truly a massive effort, and it brings together dozens of world-class scholars from the US and abroad to provide what is truly a global look at the phenomenon of Islamism. And I'm delighted that I have three of those scholars who have accepted my invitation to be here today to discuss the Muslim Brotherhood and to discuss Turkey. So let me introduce them in turn. Jonathan Schanzer is Senior Vice President for Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, one of Washington's leading think tanks. Jacob McCarty is a research fellow here at the American Foreign Policy Council, where he focuses on African geopolitics. He's also the managing editor of the Almanac, and so he has a true, what we would call a bird's eye view on the topics that we're going to be discussing. And Svante Cornell is director of AFPC's Central Asia-Caucasus Institute and one of the country's leading scholars on Eurasian and Central Asian affairs, including Turkey. Guys, thanks so much for being with me today. Before we get started, a few administrative notes for our participants online. As you'll notice, the chat function for all attendees has been tweaked. You can send messages, but it's much better if you send messages, if you have a question for our speakers, to use the Q&A feature if you're able. If you're not able, use the chat function. But if you're able to, please use the Q&A feature. I'll curate those questions, and then when we get to that point in our program. And I apologize in advance if we don't get a chance to get to all of the questions that we receive. And secondly, this program is being recorded, and within about a day, day and a half, the proceedings will be posted on AFPC's YouTube channel. You'll be able to access it in its entirety. You'll be able to link to it from the AFPC website. So we're trying to capture this for posterity. And last point, if you caught some of our previous seminars, you already know how we do these things. Rather than formal presentations, we tend to make our events something of a conversation, which we've discovered tends to lead to a more interesting and more substantive review of the topic. And that's what we're going to do today. And so with that in mind, I've prepared a few questions of my own to kickstart the conversation. So without further ado, let me ask the first question. First question is for John. John, so I think in this, what we would call a round, I wanted to to tackle the Muslim Brotherhood, and I wanted to ask you specifically, the Brotherhood is enormously influential in the Muslim world, but it's also an organization that's going through a fairly monumental intellectual transition. Can you talk a little bit about the organization's political and ideological trajectory in recent years, since the events of the Arab Spring almost a decade ago, and more recently, the ouster of Mohamed Morsi in Egypt?
Sure. And Ilan, just want to thank you and AFPC for the opportunity today. Great to be with you as well as with Svante and Jacob. Um, Look, I would say that to understand where we are, you have to obviously look at where the Muslim Brotherhood came from, looking at the origins in the 1920s in Egypt from Hassan al-Banna through Said Qutb. These were two of the ideologues that really jump-started the organization and took it to, I would say, a more radical place. These are the people that inspired a lot of the radical ideologues that came after, and in fact inspired groups like Al-Qaeda. Abdullah Azzam himself, who was a co-founder of Al-Qaeda in the 1980s, with Osama bin Laden, was heavily inspired by these thinkers. But all along this trajectory over the last 100 years or so, we have seen a brotherhood that has had to check itself because it has drawn the ire of the ruling regimes where they operate, whether it's in Egypt, where laws have had to be changed over the years to check the power of the Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood or the Islamic Action Front. In Egypt during the Arab Spring, obviously you saw the rise and precipitous fall of the Muslim Brotherhood because of the concerns that were raised by the military and the political elite. In places like the Persian Gulf, you see countries like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, that are deeply, deeply opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood because of their continued attempts to mix politics and religion. You have to remember, in most of these Middle Eastern countries, the ruling elite want to maintain a monopoly on both. They want to maintain a monopoly on the politics and on religion. And here you have an organization that's trying to define both and to mix them together. This is a big no-no in the traditional Arab countries. And so you find yourself now looking at a Muslim Brotherhood that is on its back heels. It is in many cases in exile in places like Turkey and Qatar, and I know we'll be getting to those later. Those are really the two last truly hospitable countries to this movement. But it is really at an interesting impasse. And kudos to you for pulling together this conversation, because I do believe we're going to see some interesting things coming out of the Brotherhood in the coming year or so.
Thanks, John. That's I think that's a great scene setter for what we're talking about. And let me pull Jacob. Let me pull you into this conversation. The Muslim Brotherhood is a massive organization, but it's also an organization that's spread out globally. I think by the last time I looked, there was something like no fewer than 18 separate Muslim Brotherhood branches globally. And the ones, you're an Africa specialist, the ones in North Africa tend to be, at least to my mind, some of the most interesting in terms of their political evolution, in terms of their ideological outlook. So can you talk for a little bit about what the group's footprint looks like in places like Morocco and in places like Tunisia? Sort of what do they want? How are they operating?
Sure, absolutely. And thank you again, Ilan. And I want to echo a lot of what John is saying. Turkey and Qatar and the relationships that North African countries and their Muslim Brotherhood contingencies are really defined by those bilateral relationships. We see a very pragmatic formal participation in national politics when we look at Morocco's Justice and Development Party, for example, which supported the Morsi regime until his ousting in 2012 by El-Sisi, and then it really sought to distance itself as a result. The PJD, its acronym, the party is still very, very prominent inside of Moroccan politics. For example, the most recent appointed prime minister of the country, he belongs to the PJD, but there are questions as to whether or not he's going to sort of acquiesce to those religious and political blending practices, or if he's going to default to the more pragmatic bend. He sort of has a habit or he's known pretty widely as a Francophile. So that relationship is really going to come to define a lot of the PJD moving forward. But suffice to say, I think John's absolutely right that the Muslim Brotherhood influence isn't going to be very significant moving forward. There's no evidence to suggest that it's going to revert on that. When we look at Tunisia and the Ennahda party, that in itself is its own domestic sort of quarrel and domestic tensions. It rose to power sort of modeling itself after Turkey's Islamic outlook and sort of this third way democratic example that was set by Erdogan whenever he came in after and during the Arab Spring, sort of model North African democracies after Turkey in an attempt to brand that as such. The party is less powerful and less prominent since the party has lost its ruling status. However, Ennahda is still very prominent within Tunisian domestic politics. So I think those tensions are probably still going to continue to exist. In other parts of North Africa, the Muslim Brotherhood is on the outs. Not a lot of explanation is needed to talk about Egypt. For example, as John mentioned, the Muslim Brotherhood is very much on the outs inside of the country, and LCC has remained pretty steadfast and uncompromising in his goals, or his domestic goals. And Sudan has sought to push out the group and its affiliates as the transitional government hopes to drum up support from other countries in the region, like the Egyptians and the Israelis and the Saudis. And finally, I think discussing Libya needs to be included in this, which is in sort of this weird position in its relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood. The Libyan Brotherhood does support the currently advantaged coalition, which is recognized by the United Nations as being sort of the ruling government and the legitimate government in Libya. However, this coalition is very factional. There's a lot of different groups that are vying for control within it. Whether or not the Brotherhood maintains and rises in prominence within that coalition is yet to be seen, but I think that's going to mean a lot for the organization and define a lot of the organization's future.
No, that's a great overview, and I would only point out that this is as you alluded to, this is a little bit of a dynamic rolling process, and you're seeing the Brotherhood sort of ebb and flow in terms of political salience. The Moroccans, after all, are heading into elections in the fall of 2021, so that'll be a sort of a really interesting bellwether sort of to watch. The PJD right now is very prominent. The prime minister is the fact that the prime minister is a member of the PJD is a function of their prominence in the parliament. So, this is they may be down, as you said. I would argue they're probably not out, and there is room for a comeback, which I think very very naturally leads me to the discussion of Central Asia, and I wanted to draw in Svante into this conversation. The Brotherhood is active globally, and we spent a lot of time talking about the Brotherhood in the Gulf and the Brotherhood in North Africa, but it's active in Central Asia too. And even though the picture in Central Asia is a little bit more complicated because the group is balanced, offset a little bit by what I would call ideological fellow travelers, groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir and groups like Tabligh Jamaat. But that doesn't mean that they don't have a presence there. So, my question to you, I think, is can you talk a little bit about the interplay between these actors? How are they similar? How are they different? Do they get along? What are they trying to achieve? I think that would be really helpful.
Well, thank you, Ilan. I think there are a couple of things to say about Central Asia. The first is that we may be in a pre-Brotherhood situation in a certain way in Central Asia. And also, it seems to me that the Brotherhood has had a harder time to so to speak, penetrate into non-Arab societies. I think Turkey, as we'll talk about later, is a partial exception, but they're in a very sui generis kind of way. But we see that the Brotherhood itself really hasn't been able to invest a lot of time and energy into Central Asia, and also their modus operandi, if you will, I think has not been very well suited for the type of relatively assertive secularist regimes that we've seen in Central Asia. Now, the major exception is Tajikistan, where over the past couple of years, there has been an indication of a Brotherhood presence that's been growing clandestinely in the country. But overall, we've seen over the past 25, 30 years, other types of movements that have really, as you indicated, been the most prominent Islamist actors, to some extent homegrown, but also very much outsiders. And the outsiders have been the the influences primarily from South Asia and from the global internet, if you will. By South Asia, I mean Tabligh Jamaat, which particularly has established itself in Kyrgyzstan. It's been all over the region, but in Kyrgyzstan, for example, it's more or less been adopted, if you will, by the government as a form of a lighter version of Islam that they believe on the part of the Kyrgyz government is somehow compatible with their idea of a secular, moderate Sunni Hanafi tradition. I would dispute that claim. That's a different discussion, but they have a mufti, for example, ahead of the Kyrgyz basically semi-official religious structures that is a graduate of a Pakistani Tablighi aligned outfit. The more serious problem earlier on in Central Asia was Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is unlike Tabligh Jamaat. Tabligh Jamaat is a much more, should we say, fluid, decentralized organization that's very focused just on preaching and not on politics. Hizb ut-Tahrir, by contrast, I would say, is on the other extreme with the Brotherhood in the middle. The Brotherhood being political, but also very much a rooted social organization that performs a lot of social functions. The Hizb ut-Tahrir is more of a, should we call it, a revolutionary vanguard, is what they see themselves as. A kind of non-violent version of Al-Qaeda, if you will. Non-violent in theory, because everything in their program presupposes the use of violence to actually get to power, kick all the Jews out, and whatever else they want to do. But Hizb ut-Tahrir was pretty influential in parts of Central Asia, interestingly, primarily in ethnically Uzbek areas, and also after they got stomped out of Uzbekistan very effectively and relatively violently by the Karimov government, mainly among ethnic Uzbeks in the surrounding countries, especially in Tajikistan, southern Kyrgyzstan, as well as Kazakhstan. But it seems to me that Hizb ut-Tahrir has in a way peaked in Central Asia. We heard a lot about them until about 10, 15 years ago, and lately not so much, which suggests that the governments have found ways to deal with them and also that they have lost some of their appeal. So there is a certain vacuum, and we have to see whether the Brotherhood will be able to fill it. For now, I am skeptical, especially in their current relatively complicated situation, that they would. The only thing that they would have going for them is that based out of Turkey as they are now, they would have inroads into Central Asia that they may have not had in the past.
No, that's a great great description. You mentioned Turkey. You said the magic word. So let me sort of pivot a little bit and sort of change our conversation slightly, because there's a lot of connectivity there between Central Asia on the one hand and Turkey on the other, in terms of sort of the natural geopolitical reach that Turkey has and thinks it has. But it's also an ideological conversation as well. So, I think this is sort of a natural pivot point. John, let me pull you in here, because because it's something that you've written about a lot. So here's the question. Over the past 2 decades, the government of Recep Tayyip Erdogan has emerged as charitably one of the most vexing problems that we face in a bipartisan fashion in Washington. The bill of particulars, right? You've written about it. I've written about it. We've all written about it. It's pretty long and involves everything from helping Iran to bust sanctions applied by the United States, to Turkey's intentions in its intervention with Syria, to regional activism in North Africa and the Middle East. Can you talk for a few minutes about that arc of behavior and how it's evolved, what it means for them, what it means for us?
Sure. You're right that it's a vexing problem. It's also vexing just in terms of understanding the motivation of a NATO ally, a longstanding US ally, a country that not too long ago aspired to join the European Union, and now increasingly looks like a classic Middle Eastern state with all the problems that come with it. You mentioned the sanctions busting scheme that it was involved in working with Iran. I mean, that is true. But what I think also needs to be noted is that this was the largest sanctions evasion scheme in modern history. $20 billion worth of illicit finance to Iran at the height of its drive toward a nuclear program. The support that Turkey provides to Hamas is significant. They are the largest headquarters for Hamas outside of the Gaza Strip, and all sorts of flavors of actors are operating there: fundraisers, military operatives, political operatives as well. And Turkey does this to some extent to gain leverage over countries like Israel. But in many ways, you see this sort of activity as an attempt to galvanize support from the rest of the Middle East, to serve as sort of the leader of the Middle East, if you will. This is at least in some ways, it's been described as such. And it's really interesting. Of course, Turkey hit its peak somewhere around 2011, 2012, working very closely with the Obama administration when it looked like the Arab Spring was going to sprout a number of Muslim Brotherhood governments. It appeared that Erdogan was there to provide a steadying hand and to help some of these countries reach a sort of a soft landing. And this was something that President Obama valued greatly. Of course, as we know, all of this began to unravel. And yet we still continue to see this kind of activity, the sanctions busting, the support for Hamas, the support for ISIS, or at least turning a blind eye to fighters coming in to fight on behalf of ISIS, traveling through Turkey to get there. The range of other violent Islamist actors that were operating in Syria. So I would say that this has been an evolving strategy. On the one hand, it was political at first in an attempt to harness this new movement. Over time, though, it's much harder to pin down what has been driving Erdogan. Increasingly, it looks like he's just trying to get under the skin of every other country in the region, including also abroad in places like the United States, now acquiring the S-400 in defiance of the United States. Very vexing foreign policy, very challenging, and really not accommodating. And at some point soon, I think we're seeing indicators from the United States and from Europe that this behavior is ultimately going to earn Turkey sanctions, which is, again, astounding to think about when you consider the fact that this is a NATO ally and a longstanding Western ally that was really relied upon for many years to be a bulwark against all of the things that Turkey has been doing over the last 10 to 20 years.
No, I think that's a really good primer. I want to sort of later, I think I want to come back and sort of ask the same question to Svante, right? Svante's lived for a few years in Turkey, and I want to sort of to pull on that thread a little bit ideologically. But John, you said something that I think is really sort of interesting. This idea of Turkey styling itself as an ideological leader during the unfolding of the Arab Spring, and it was a role that was embraced by the United States, but it wasn't necessarily accepted by regional governments. And so, Jacob, the question I wanted to ask you about this was that, that process that John talked about, at the outset of the Arab Spring, Erdogan took this very public trip, in particular to a lot of places, but in particular to North Africa, to sell his government's vision of what he at the time was calling Islamic democracy. But by all accounts, the reception was pretty chilly that he received. And it really sort of, I think, helped define the contours of the appeal of Turkish foreign policy. So let's fast forward a few years. Does this vision actually have resonance in Africa? Why would it be appealing? Why is it? Why isn't it? Can you sort of shed some light on that?
Sure. So I think John gets it exactly right. And a lot of it, as I see it, depended on Erdogan's relationship with Morsi. Right as soon as Morsi gets out, and then LCC is able to kind of rise, there goes a lot of the legitimacy that is rooted in Erdogan's attempts and campaigns throughout North Africa, because he no longer has that relationship across the Mediterranean. When you look at other potential relationships, as I mentioned before, the current prime minister of Morocco, there's competing aspects and competing relationships that exist, and simply Turkey isn't able to offer the same kind of things that other relationships that Morocco has and that the Moroccan government has are able to sort of fill. This is really exemplified most recently whenever the Moroccans just announced maybe 2 months ago or so that they'll be joining the Saudi-led boycott of Turkish products coming into the country. So that just sort of proves how there's competing interests, there's competing value, and competing aspects to sort of this proxy relationship that's going on and across, really between Turkey and Qatar, and then the Saudi coalition and their outreach to the region as well. Really the only staying power that I would say or at least proven staying power that the Turkish government has had as a model for North Africa, again, has been Tunisia. And that a lot is due to the logistics of the local party of Ennehda, which is led by someone named Rashid Ghannouchi, who he has been very, very capable at sort of maintaining himself and being very pragmatic locally, proven whenever he survived a vote of no confidence as the head of the Tunisian legislature, partially due to his dealings with the Turkish government and his relationship with Erdogan as well. And he's been able, even after that, to remain so prominent, so successful as to potentially influence other future cabinet administration votes, because he's been able to sort of whip this coalition into shape around him. If he's not in place, then the coalition isn't in place, and that goes so far as to affect who the president is appointing and moving forward to sort of affect the government and its attempts to build a now technocratic, semi-secular government. That also moves its way into Libya as well. It really exemplifies sort of the domestic tension that's happening in Tunisia as the Turks are selling or attempting to sell drones to the Tunisians and drawing them into the Libyan conflict and using Tunisia as a place to base their drones to conduct drone strikes. So far, Tunisia has been able to sort of toe a line and focus primarily domestically. Whether or not they're able to draw them into the greater conflict to further Turkey's ambitions in the region has yet to be seen. But I think that's something that we certainly need to pay attention to.
No, that's a great description. And it actually gets me to that conversation that I wanted to have with you, Svante, about strategic objectives and sort of ideological direction. Can you talk about that? I mean, Jacob, I think, laid out a very variegated picture of a Turkey that has its finger in a lot of pies and it has sort of lots of sort of presence in North Africa, has a lot of presence in the Middle East. But what are the objectives here globally, and what are the shaping forces that are really influencing Turkish ideological direction, Turkish foreign policy?
Well, thank you for that question. I don't know how much time we have. I think the short answer is I call Tayyip Erdogan a pragmatic ideologue. He is successful because he has a certain level of pragmatism, quite a significant pragmatism, especially when he's pushed into a corner. He's able, as not all ideologues are, to take a step or maybe two backwards in order to further his long-term goals. But at the same time, I think there is no question that, and by now, I mean, I've been saying this for a very long time, but I think very few people now dispute the fact that there is an Islamist ideology very, very deeply motivating him and his actions. And you can term this in many ways. You can talk about a mentality, a worldview. He's not himself an academic, but his instincts, his upbringing, all of this tends to make him a very strong Islamist ideologue. Now, we could talk at length about the origins of the Turkish Islamist movement, but it has a very strong influence from the ideas of the Muslim Brotherhood. But it's worth mentioning that the social context in Turkey is very different. Already by the 1960s, when Turkish Islamism was really beginning to take shape and to develop into a political movement by the end of that decade, Turkish society, thanks very much to Ataturk's reform 40 years earlier, had really established itself as a much more secular, in many ways, at least in the urban areas and in the coasts, a much more liberal society than, for example, Egypt. Yes, by Western standards, it's still in many ways a conservative society, but I think Turkey is markedly different in this regard from most countries in the Muslim Middle East. Now, when Tayyip, and I think I mentioned this because I think it has affected and continues to affect the choices and the realities in which Erdogan is making his policy. Now, after he took charge in 2002, he really spent most of his time consolidating power. And then really when the 2011 Arab upheavals hit is where you see the full force of the ideology move in, when Erdogan and his closest lieutenants, particularly Ahmet Davutoglu, who was then the foreign minister, really see this as the historic opportunity that they've been waiting for decades. The monarchies, as they call them, Mubarak included, were falling, and this was a time for what they called, especially with Western interlocutors, the democratic forces in the Middle East to take power. What they meant, of course, was the Islamists like themselves. And this is when Turkey internationally in the region tried to impose, should we say, kind of an arc of Muslim Brotherhood ruled regimes all over the Middle East and North Africa. And at home, Erdogan really accelerated the efforts to Islamize Turkey, particularly through the education system, the building of a huge religious hierarchy called, or organization called the Diyanet, and so on. The key takeaway is that this didn't work. It first of all didn't work abroad, as we all know, because Turkey turned all of its relations sour with everybody else, very much in most cases as a result of its own actions. Egypt is only the most obvious case of this. Spoiling relations with the Arab Emirates, with Saudi Arabia, let alone, of course, with Israel, Syria, and others, Iraq, is something we can talk at length about. But I think it's equally interesting to me, at least, that the effort to Islamize Turkey at home also seems to have hit roadblocks. It seems to me that there was a romantic notion in much of Erdogan's close entourage that Turkey had this role as a natural leader in the Middle East that would be embraced just because Turkey was now Islamic and no longer emphasized secular Republican values. And similarly, there was, I think, also some romantic notion, or they just hadn't thought about it, that Turkish society would accept this top-down Islamism that they were trying to impose. Now, we saw that didn't work in Iran, of course, and we're seeing that it doesn't work in Turkey. Now, here it's important to note that, and I bring up Iran for a reason, that society has become less of a follower of the regime's ideology. That hasn't stopped the regime from being a continuously dangerous actor on the international scene as long as it stayed in power. And I think we may be facing a similar situation with Turkey. On the other hand, there's a difference. And the difference, as I mentioned, is that Turkey is still a country where you can't ignore the voice of the people completely. You can tinker with it, you can play with it, and they are definitely. But we see, for example, that even the conservative families in Turkey and the conservative areas don't want to send their kids to Islamic schools, the Imam Hatip schools. They just refuse to. And they demonstrate and they actually create riots in Turkey over this. And if you look at public opinion polls, you find that Turkish society is getting progressively more secular in spite of everything Erdogan is trying to do, and maybe because they feel that this is something that is now being pushed on them from the top, and they don't like it. Now, this also means that Erdogan, who still has to win elections, even though it's an unfair, playing field, has to continue to find allies. He's never had enough people to rule Turkey by himself. In the beginning, he was using liberals, he was using Kurdish conservative forces. They've all been sidelined, jailed in many cases, and he has struck up this alliance with the extreme right nationalists in Turkey. And I think you see both in domestic and in foreign policy the implications of this. Now, to round this up, in the foreign policy scene, it seems to me that sometimes you look at Turkey and it looks like there's a car with two drivers. So you have a Turkey that is returning to the old-fashioned late 1990s policies, picking fights with the Greeks, caring about Cyprus, getting involved in conflicts between Armenia and Azerbaijan. This is not Erdogan's traditional priorities. These are the traditional priorities of Turkish nationalists, which are represented by the likes of Defense Minister Hulusi Akar, for example. And then you also have the rhetoric, the anti-Saudi, anti-Israeli, anti-Emirati, anti-Egyptian, pro-Muslim Brotherhood rhetoric, and also actions such as the support for Hamas, as well as some of the other policies that Erdogan seems to be driving. And I don't know if, for the time being, there is an unholy, uneasy alliance between these, but we see rifts between them. And I think this could get very interesting in the coming years. But I think we see different drivers today, and it's changing fast, the drivers in Turkish foreign policy. Some remain, there are some new ones. Erdogan himself has been forced, in order to maintain public support, seeing, I think, that Islamism really doesn't command the level of support in society it did some years ago, when they were seen as something cleaner, something more honest, something purer, which of course everybody now knows they're not because of the clientelism and the corruption. he has been gravitating and whipping up nationalist feelings, and he is trying to make a policy on this basis, a kind of Islamic nationalist alliance, if you will. I think it's going to get more lively and it's going to get more interesting before long.
No, that's a great overview, and I tend to subscribe to that notion that there's more here than meets the eye, and there's a lot of fast movers in the conversation. So I have questions. I always have questions, but excuse me, in particular, I have questions because you guys have sort of opened up a Pandora's box about U.S. policy. So I have a few here, but let me remind our audience that if you want to ask a question to the panelists, you can use the Q&A function or the chat function at the bottom of your screens to ask a question. I think we'll have time for 1 or 2 questions. I always have questions, but it'd be great to hear from all of you. But with that, let me, John, let me sort of pivot to you again and ask you a question about U.S. policy, because it's already pretty clear that the new administration, the incoming administration, is going to focus on the Middle East in general, but in particular to focus on Iran in the context of maybe, maybe not, going back to the 2015 nuclear framework known as the JCPOA, pressure potentially on Saudi Arabia with regard to a more stern, sort of more full-throated condemnation of human rights abuses. But this is all happening, and sort of you have to set the scene for the new administration's Middle East policy based upon things that have happened over the last half decade. And a great deal has happened. What does the new administration really need to keep in mind here about the Brotherhood specifically, but also about the new regional context that we're increasingly seeing in the Middle East?
Not easy questions to answer. I'll try to unpack some of these things. On Turkey, I think we're likely heading into a fairly tumultuous period. I think, if you take a reading of the NDAA and the application of CAATSA sanctions, the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions, in response to the Turkish acquisition and activation of the S-400, I think it's likely you're going to see some action there, some sanctions imposed, and that will, of course, place great strain on the U.S.-Turkey relationship. I think it's probably overdue, and I think it's probably important for Turkey to see that the U.S. is willing to back up its words with deeds. Because unfortunately, what we saw during the Trump years was there was a tendency to want to lay off, which, by the way, is not, I would say it's probably not unique to the Trump administration. There's been an attempt for decades now to try to maintain the course with Turkey despite itself, to value the relationship despite everything that it's done to undermine that relationship. I think that's coming to probably an abrupt end. I think Biden has indicated already that he's maybe more willing, or his advisors are more willing to take a tougher line. I think that's going to be important. I think, by the way, it's also important to bring in Qatar into all of this. Right now, we're seeing an indication that the Trump administration is trying to paper over the differences between Qatar and its rivals in the GCC. Without really addressing the underlying challenges. The reason why Qatar has been pushed out is because of its support for the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist movements. And that's going to be, I think, something to watch, because I don't think any papering over of those differences will last very long. I think you might see a re-eruption of that Gulf rift. And I think probably for good reason. If we're going to be trying to mend those fences, if you will, we're going to need to get to the core issues involved, and the Brotherhood really lies at the center of that. And Qatar, I think, really is yet to be held to account for kind of it's double dealing. On the one hand, it's a valuable U.S. ally, allowing us to use their base in Qatar for forward operations for CENTCOM. On the other hand, they're engaging with a wide range of actors associated with Islamists that are running counter to American foreign policy. Getting to the Brotherhood itself, we've seen efforts by the Trump administration and a new initiative launched by Senator Ted Cruz to try to designate the Brotherhood. I have looked at this. I looked at it when I was inside Treasury some 15, 20 years ago, and I've looked at it recently again. I think it's going to be challenging. I think the reason for that is that the Brotherhood as a movement is not the same country to country. Each national brand, if you will, each franchise of the Brotherhood has a different approach and a different perspective on the use of violence, on the imposition of Islamic law, or other things that might kind of spark designation in the US. And so it's for that reason that I think the US, through the Treasury Department or the State Department, needs to go and look at each one of these groups on their own and to assess individually whether they meet criteria for designation. The entire movement will not, because you have groups in Jordan or Morocco that are more political in nature and have been nonviolent for many years. And then in other places like Yemen or Libya or Syria, they have groups that have actively engaged in violence. We can show that with evidence. And I think it would be a lot easier to reach that bar. And so my sense is that if the US is truly serious about trying to curb the growth of the Brotherhood and to punish it for its malign activities, this is the way to go, not a broad designation, which would likely fail to pass through the Department of Justice, would not meet the criteria that their lawyers in the White House and elsewhere would apply to this. And then it would make it look, unfortunately, like the Brotherhood is, well, it gets off scot-free. That would be a calamity in my view. I think if we're serious about going after violent groups, let's go after them one at a time. I think that's the recipe for success.
It's I think a great point, and something that is, I think, left an open conversation. I'm not sure that the incoming administration, there's going to be much appetite to revisit this sort of, the designation question as a whole. But I take your point that this is a sort of a multi-armed entity that we have to sort of calibrate our policy towards. But so let me pull in Jacob here as well, because I think there's an Africa angle here. And I say this advisedly because historically, Africa has been a bit of a black hole in terms of U.S. policy on a bipartisan basis. We really haven't allocated as much resources or attention to the African continent as we should, frankly. But there's a lot going on in North Africa, on the continent as a whole, but in North Africa specifically, right? And you can sort of look across the continent and see, hotspots like Libya, hotspots like Ethiopia, and there's a tremendous amount going on. And so, can you talk? Just you started already, sort of in your previous answer, talking about where the Brotherhood and Turkey fit in and all this. Can you sort of elaborate? Talk about Libya a little bit.
Certainly, I think that the new administration is going to find, and the region is going to find, that whether they want to say it right now or acknowledge it right now or not, Libya is still going to be a major focal point for Middle East and North African policy moving forward. And something is going to have to be done to recognize that and to sort of move the barometer in that direction. As said before, the Government of National Accords, which is supported by governments and multilateral institutions all over the world, is backed in part by the Muslim Brotherhood. This isn't monopolized by any means. There's a number of factions that are active in its administration and its efforts. And so the Muslim Brotherhood's influence moving forward is certainly not concrete. However, Turkey has been a vocal supporter and a munition supporter and a financial supporter of the GNA for years now, going so far as to back it in sort of that divisive and decisive battle in Tripoli, which started last year. And possibly without the assistance of the Turkish government, the GNA would not have been able to succeed in repelling Khalifa Haftar's forces from the city, despite months of trying to actually invade it on the part of the general. The degree of influence of prominent Muslim Brotherhood members is likely going to define GNA foreign policy and GNA foreign relations, especially if it does come out sort of the decisive victor in the Libyan civil war, as much as a decisive victor, a sort of a quagmire the Libyan civil war is. That is going to define a lot of relations, and the incoming Biden administration should acknowledge that and should recognize that and be observant of the relationships that are being formed as a result. Turkey is likely also going to continue drawing and attempting to draw in other countries, most notably Tunisia, but also others, into the fight, which will only complicate the Libyan issue further. Again, Libya and Algeria have both attempted to insulate themselves from the outpouring effects and the outcropping effects of the Libyan civil war as they're defining their own domestic policy. But that doesn't mean Turkey isn't going to stop trying to draw in, most notably Tunisia, into the violence. Again, I think it's also very important to keep in mind the security situation in Sudan. Sudan only rebuked Omar al-Bashir and removed and deposed Omar al-Bashir from power last year. And there's still remnants of his support network within the Muslim Brotherhood and its offshoots and Hamas inside of the country, despite enacting and announcing that it will enact legislation to push these groups out. Hamas has signaled that it is going to attempt to continue to operate within Sudan. This might just be Hamas broadcasting itself as it's one to do in the past, or this could be legitimate. This is going to be, one cannot rule out the intention of an organization like Hamas to use a historically and currently fragile space to meet their continued goals, especially as they pertain to the rest of the Red Sea and Yemen and all other neighboring countries in the area.
No, that's great. And let me go out of sequence a little bit because I know that that John's done quite a bit of work on Sudan. So anytime I get the virtual 2-finger rule, I want to honor it. So John, tell us what we because I think Jacob did a good job of explaining how we navigate or begin to navigate the conversation. But what else do we need to know about Sudan?
Yeah, so Jacob, I think just tee this up the right way. Look, Sudan for decades now has been that nexus between the Muslim Brotherhood and a range of violent actors. This is a government that came into power in 1989. It really was the first and only Muslim Brotherhood country in the modern era. And under Hassan al-Turabi and Omar al-Bashir, they ran a country that really facilitated terrorism through the Muslim Brotherhood network. And so used to have these international Islamist gatherings once a year where groups like Hamas would come together with Al-Qaeda, with Iran, with Hezbollah. And this was really if there was any one country that personified the risk of Muslim Brotherhood and violent Islamist activity, that was it. And so the toppling of Omar al-Bashir last year and the kind of reconstruction of the country and the peace deal that was just announced with Israel and some of the other laws that have been amended to end female genital mutilation, to create a separation between mosque and state, all of these things are remarkable changes and represent a real crushing blow to the Muslim Brotherhood movement writ large. And also, I should just say to Turkey as well, as they look to establish kind of more and more of a beachhead in Africa, this was a serious step backwards for them. So this is, I think, a really terrific step forward. The question right now is, and this is a question for the next Biden administration, will there be additional efforts to try to help Sudan take further steps in the right direction? Or are we going to just see kind of that same bipartisan indifference that you mentioned, Ilan, where we're just not putting as much of an emphasis in Africa? But I do think that Sudan represents a really pivotal country in this ideological battle that we've been trying to fight for so long. It was a huge victory for the United States, whether the United States knew it or not.
No, listen, I think that's great. And I think that's exactly the right context. And both you and Jacob, I think, did a great job in explaining exactly how dynamic what's happening in Africa really is, because, on our chosen subject, on the subject of Islamic radicalism, on what we're seeing a transformation of the trend, right? And Sudan is part of that conversation. Sudan is sort of one of these pockets that is actually trending in the positive direction for now. But we're seeing a lot of the continent trend in a different direction. And so, both of you, I think, emphasize what I would argue the most important point, which is that whatever kind of attention, right, and not all of our attention is benign, but whatever kind of our national attention is needed, at least we need more of it. We need more sort of involvement, more strategic awareness of what's happening on the continent. And I think John, you mentioned Turkey sort of in passing in the conversation, and I wanted to sort of to piggyback on that and ask Svante a question about Turkey, and also sort of to try to rope in some of the questions that we've gotten in the chat so far. I think it's fair to say that the Trump administration has had a very laissez-faire, hands-off attitude towards Turkey in general. And charitably, it's been sort of Turkey is seen as a sometime partner that will satisfy certain strategic objectives in Syria, but policy is shifting. And so, how do you expect that to be different under Biden? And what does the new U.S. administration need to understand in turn about what's happening in Ankara, sort of, this geopolitical landscape that you laid out? And then when you're done, I have a follow-on question as well.
Okay. Well, I think there are several points. One is that Erdogan and the Turkish leadership have a feeling that first, that we need them more than they need us. That's number one. And second, that they can play the United States. And both under the Obama administration and under the Trump administration, they've been proven right in a way. They have convinced us that we need them more than we need them, which may not be the case. I'm not saying that we don't need Turkey, but I'm saying that they need us much more than they would let us know, than they want us to know, rather. So that's the first part. And why have they been able to do this? I think first, because there has been no strategy. There have been some good attempts under both administrations, including the Trump administration, when they imposed sanctions on Turkey for a short while for the Pastor Brunson issue, and that immediately yielded results, but that was never followed up. It never led to a strategy. So it seems to me that any kind of policy, in order to have results with Turkey, needs to be coherent and long-term. Now, I know that's not necessarily likely in Washington, but we can wish, right? And I think this is where John's point about the tough line comes in. And I agree with John. We should have a tough line. But what I'm worried about, if you have a tough line that is not part of a strategy, it could actually, it might work, and it might also generate very unintended consequences. So I think what's interesting to see right now is both the challenges Turkey poses, but also some of the opportunities. And the opportunities come from, for example, the Turkish-Russian confrontation, which we've seen very clearly in Syria. We've seen it in Libya, and we've seen it with some form of arrangement between them in the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And it seems to me that this confrontation with Turkey with Russia has spooked a lot of Turks and made a lot of people in Ankara, not perhaps Erdogan, but a lot of influential people wake up and smell the coffee, so to speak. I think it took away some of the, anti-Americanism that was really a result of the widely believed conspiracy theory that the US was behind the coup somehow. Second, the economic situation in Turkey is really bad. And that has already forced Erdogan to float some trial balloons about judicial reforms and the like, simply because he knows that the Qataris are not going to, they just don't have enough money to bail him out. So that presents opportunities as well as pitfalls. Now, if we alienate Turkey without having a strategy of carrots and sticks that are actually effective and that makes them understand what the stakes are, if we misplay it, if you will, there is a real risk that the winner will be not so much Russia, but actually China, which is actively courting Turkey and moving into the Turkish economy very aggressively. So I say carrots and sticks, but I think most important is clarity. And if I can just make 3 points, I think one, we need to make clear to Turkey, A, that we will not tolerate the anti-Israeli and often anti-Semitic policies and rhetoric, as well as the outbursts of anti-Americanism that Erdogan is engaging in. There will be consequences. B, we need to make clear that we will not accept this support for Islamic radical organizations, including the Muslim Brotherhood. They have to curtail that very severely. Third, or C, I think that we should make sure that Turkey understand also that there is an upside. If they give up on these policies and these destructive policies, there is a lot of things we can work together with Turkey on. For example, countering Russia in the Black Sea region. We can help them get a seat at the table in the Eastern Mediterranean gas issue and to repair all the relationships that they have messed up over the past couple of years. And I think there are a lot of people, particularly on the nationalist side in Turkey, who understand that simultaneously pissing off Israelis, Egyptians, Emiratis, and Saudis for no real upshot was not a very smart policy. So finally, we have to make it their choice, and they have to understand the choice. We have to help them to make the right choice.
So that's great. And you actually, I think you anticipated my question, right? Because my follow-on question was going to be something on the order of, is it possible to forge a new Turkey consensus, right? Because that's what we're really looking at. It sounds to me like you think it's possible, right? But it requires articulation of sort of very clear principles.
Well, I'd like to hear what John has to say and Jacob, but I mean, this is if we had a country where one person set the policy and I was allowed to do that, this would be my line. Now, do I think this is realistic? I think, frankly, it's going to be difficult because, especially in Congress and in many parts of the U.S. government, particularly not so much the Pentagon, but other areas, there is the level of anger and disappointment, feeling of betrayal by the way Turkey has behaved as a supposed ally has gone so far that it's going to be very difficult to restore it. And whenever somebody tries to restore it, Erdogan will go out in one of his tirades that's going to destroy all the work that good people are trying to do on both sides to try to improve the relationship. So I'm not necessarily very optimistic.
All right. Well, no, and that's great. And so, all right, John, you were called out. So let me bring you in here and let me ask you if you think it's possible as well.
Yeah, look, I think it's possible. And I think that Turkey, this is all, I think, the result of maybe one man or one party, depending on how you view it. And that Turkey has been steered in the wrong direction for quite a while. The problem is the further down this road you go, the harder it is to turn. And that's, I think, the reason why we should be perhaps somewhat pessimistic right now. I mean, I would say that right now, Turkey qualifies to be a state sponsor of terrorism to the letter of the law here in the United States. Now, I don't think we're going to go that far in terms of designation, but to get Turkey to stop that activity is going to be a serious challenge. Now, I do think that there are lots of carrots that we can offer, as well as threatening with sticks. But I have not seen, I mean, there have been, I think, many opportunities where US government officials have gone to Turkey. They've talked about the problems that they've seen. They've explained what the ramifications could be if they continue to, for example, engage in sanctions busting on behalf of Iran, that there could be real problems. They've ignored it time and again. I mean, Halkbank right now is being sued by the Department of Justice. And 10 years ago, they were being warned not to do this. So they had their chance to turn around. They didn't. So my real concern here is, how do you get a man who has really amassed a majority of power in this country, seems to be completely indifferent to American attempts to get him to turn back toward the alliance and to embrace the United States? How does one do that when his inclination appears to be one where, even with his tensions with Russia, he continues to flirt with the Russians, even though there seems to be blowback now in the Eastern Med or in other areas around the Middle East, he continues to support these actors that are pushing him into isolation. It's very hard to understand the man's logic here. He appears to be content jumping from one crisis to another without a strategy, and that is what is really, really disconcerting as an analyst of the region.
I had a friend mention to me recently that Davutoglu, when he was foreign minister, he had a policy of 0 problems with neighbors, and now Turkey has 100% problems with neighbors. But I, to Svante's point, I think it's necessary to point out that Erdogan isn't the sum total of Turkey, and Erdogan isn't forever. So, U.S. policy has to at least be nimble enough to account for that fact. So, all right. So I couldn't, by the way, have scripted this any better. I think we're coming up on our last couple minutes. So let me bring Jacob back into the conversation and ask him if he has any final thoughts, any summation, just in the last minute we have remaining.
Sure. I'm very curious about what low-hanging fruit might exist in sort of a reset between U.S.-Turkish relations. Some of that low-hanging fruit, one might expect, should be achievable. However achievable it is has yet to be seen, like asking Erdogan to stop hosting the leaders of Hamas in very public meetings. That seems doable. Whether or not he will commit to that, I think, is its own separate conversation. I also think that there's ground in potential relations, whether or not, and Turkey likely does, both sides consider the fact that Russia is going to be putting a sea base in Sudan. is that an issue? Is that common ground where you can sort of reset the relation through the Red Sea? Because Turkey is obviously concerned about its own base and its own positioning. Again, whether or not there's common ground that can exist there, who's to say? But I think there's potential.
All right, guys, I think we're going to have to leave it there. This has been really spectacular. John, Jacob, Svante, thank you for what's been really a terrific and thought-provoking discussion. And thanks again, everybody who tuned in, and thanks everybody who's watching after the fact of this, watching this recording on YouTube. Thank you for joining us, and a couple of housekeeping items by way of conclusion. As I said, this video will be up online in the next day and a half or so, and feel free to watch in part or in whole. Feel free to share. And if you haven't already, please go ahead and visit the World Almanac of Islamism. It's available online at almanac.afpc.org. The selection of our speakers today was not a coincidence. All of the people represented on the screen have put in yeoman's work on the almanac, writing different chapters, contributing. It's really sort of a very, I think, robust and comprehensive intellectual effort to try to understand what, as you guys heard over the last hour, is a very multivariated and very complex problem, and you know, in a global system that's shifting. So thank you guys once again for helping us try to make a little bit of sense of it. For everybody that's watching, for everybody that's tuning in, I hope you'll join us next month when we host another one of these. We're going to be covering Islamism in Asia, in South Asia, and in Southeast Asia, and how the phenomenon rebounds and represents there. So until then, thank you guys. Thank you from the American Foreign Policy Council, and have a wonderful rest of the day.